"Please don't come inside," said a single mom to the mean and lonely cowboy who wanted her love. The morning sun had only just begun to peek over the mountains when Clara pulled open the wooden shutters of her small farmhouse. The soft light spilled into the room, catching the faint dust floating in the air. Her hands were coated in flour, her apron already streaked with the evidence of an early start. She kneaded the dough on the rough table, the rhythm of it steady and soothing, a rare kind of peace she had taught herself to find in silence. Behind her, the sound of her daughter's light footsteps came down the stairs. "Mama," little Elsie murmured sleepily, rubbing her eyes. Clara turned with a tired but loving smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Wash up. Breakfast's near ready." Life had hardened Clara early. Her husband had gone 2 winters ago, leaving behind little more than debts, a broken wagon, and a promise he never kept. The townsfolk whispered about her now. That poor widow trying to run the ranch alone, that girl who still thinks she doesn't need a man. But Clara didn't care. She'd learned that a woman's worth didn't come from who stood beside her, but how she stood when no one else would. The knock on the door came sharp and sudden. Clara froze, her hands still pressing the dough. Few people came uninvited, and the hour was too early for neighbors. Her eyes darted toward the window, where the faint outline of a man stood against the light. Broad shoulders, hat pulled low, boots heavy in the dust. Her heart gave a slow, uneasy thud. It was him, Wyatt Kane, the lonely cowboy who had wandered into town a month back, looking for work and finding instead the edges of Clara's quiet world. He was rough, with eyes like storm clouds and a past no one dared ask about. Men said he'd been a drifter, a fighter, maybe even a killer. Women said he was dangerous, that his silence carried too much weight, and his stare too much hunger. Clara had seen both, the wildness and the sadness, and something inside her had wanted to help him, even when she knew better. Now he stood at her door again. "Clara," he called, his voice low and gravelly. "You there?" She hesitated, her palms damp with more than flour. The girl looked up at her, curious. "Stay inside, Elsie," she whispered. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door, just a crack. Wyatt's gaze met hers. He looked tired, dust clinging to his shirt, jaw set as if he'd wrestled the morning itself. His eyes softened when they found her face. "You ain't been to town in days. Thought maybe you needed help." "I don't," she said quietly. "You sure about that?" He leaned a little on the doorframe, the faint scent of leather and smoke drifting in. "That fence still needs mending. And winter's close." She swallowed hard. There was something in his tone. Not pity, not mockery, but something heavier. "Loneliness maybe. I can manage," she said. "You should go." He shifted, eyes flicking past her shoulder into the kitchen, where the scent of bread and warmth filled the air. "You always say that, but I don't see anyone here helping you." "I don't need help," she replied, firmer now. Wyatt's hand brushed the frame. "You don't have to keep me outside, Clara." She hesitated, heart pounding. He wasn't threatening. Not quite, but there was a need in his eyes she didn't trust. Maybe it was because it mirrored something she tried to hide in herself. That deep, aching need for someone to care, to take the burden, even for a while. But she remembered too well the last time she let someone close. The pain, the betrayal, the cold nights spent alone afterward. "Please don't come inside," she whispered, barely above the wind. He blinked. "Why not?" "Because I know what happens after that," she said, her voice trembling. "Because once you step through that door, nothing will be the same. And I can't afford another heartbreak, not when she's watching." His gaze followed hers to the small figure standing by the table, pretending not to listen. His jaw tightened. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said softly. "Then don't make me hope," she replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to still, the quiet between them louder than any storm. Then Wyatt nodded slowly, stepping back. "All right," he murmured. "I'll stay out." He turned to leave, but before he did, he took off his hat and held it against his chest. "You ever change your mind, Clara?" he said. "I'll be here. Not for pity, not for you to fix me. Just here." She watched him walk away, dust swirling around his boots until he disappeared down the road. Days turned to weeks, and winter crept close. The nights grew colder, the sky heavy with frost. Clara worked harder, but her strength waned. She'd see Wyatt sometimes, from a distance, fixing a broken fence post on her land, leaving chopped wood by her barn before dawn. He never knocked again, never asked to come in. One morning, a blizzard rolled through the valley. The wind howled like something alive. The snow buried paths and swallowed fences whole. Clara kept the fire going, wrapping Elsie in quilts. But the cold crept through the walls, fierce and merciless. When the door rattled, she thought it was the wind, until she heard the voice. Clara. Wyatt's shout came faint and rough through the storm. Clara, open up. Her heart leapt, torn between fear and something else. She pulled the latch, and the door flew open against the wind. Wyatt stumbled in, covered in snow, his hands clutching a small bundle. He looked almost ghostly. You got livestock trapped by the creek, he said breathlessly. I freed what I could, but the shed's near collapse. She wanted to thank him, but words caught in her throat. His face was pale, his breath ragged, and when he dropped to one knee, she saw the crimson stain spreading across his sleeve. Wyatt, just a graze, he muttered. Fence wire caught me. Without thinking, she caught his arm. You'll freeze to death. He gave a weak smile. You told me not to come inside. Please, she whispered, her eyes wet. Please, come inside. He laughed faintly, the sound half a sigh. Gladly, she pulled him toward the fire, stripping off his soaked coat, pressing cloth to the wound. Her hands trembled, not from cold but from something deeper, the fear of caring again. The fear of losing. Hours passed as the storm raged outside. Wyatt slept, his breathing steady but weak. Elsie sat quietly by the fire, watching her mother's face, the worry etched deep. Is he bad, Mama? Clara shook her head. He'll be all right. When Wyatt woke, the storm had eased. He found her asleep in a chair beside him, head resting on her folded arms. Elsie was curled on a rug, clutching a small blanket. He stared at them both, something warm stirring in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. By morning, the world was white and still. Clara stirred, her eyes meeting his. You stayed, she whispered. He nodded. You asked me to. She smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd seen from her. You can stay until you heal. Wyatt looked toward the window, where sunlight spilled across the snow. And after, she hesitated. We'll see. Through the winter, they worked side by side, mending fences, feeding livestock, laughing quietly in the cold mornings. Wyatt never asked for more, and Clara never offered. Yet something unspoken grew between them, not fire, but a slow, steady warmth. When spring finally came, the valley turned green again. The air was sweet with thaw and promise. Wyatt saddled his horse one morning, ready to leave. Clara stood by the gate, her apron fluttering in the breeze. You don't have to go, she said softly. He looked at her, eyes full of things he couldn't say. I told myself I'd stay, till the storm passed. Didn't know it'd be you I'd be leaving behind. She stepped closer. Maybe you don't have to leave anything behind. Wyatt smiled. Slow, sad, and real. You sure you want me inside this time? Her lips curved faintly. Please, she whispered, come inside. He took her hand, rough fingers brushing against hers, and for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. The farmhouse door creaked open, the scent of bread and spring air blending together. Outside, the wind carried the last chill of winter away, leaving only warmth, the kind that had been waiting all along, just beyond the threshold. Wyatt stepped across the threshold slowly, as if afraid that one wrong move might shatter the fragile peace that had bloomed between them. The air inside the farmhouse was warm, carrying the comforting scent of freshly baked bread and wood smoke. He stood still for a moment, taking it in, the small space, the sound of the fire crackling softly, the way Clara's hair caught the light from the window like strands of honey. He'd been in countless places over the years, sleeping under open skies and inside barns, but never had a room felt like this, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something good to happen. Clara turned from the hearth, her hands brushing a bit of flour from her apron, her gaze meeting his with hesitation and something else. Quiet fear, yes, but also trust. A trust she hadn't given anyone in years. You can sit, she said softly, motioning toward the chair near the table. Wyatt nodded and removed his hat, setting it gently on the counter. He moved carefully, his tall frame seeming almost out of place in the modest kitchen. but there was a tenderness in how he carried himself now, the kind that comes when a man knows the ground beneath his boots is sacred. Elsie peeked from behind the doorway, her wide blue eyes curious and unguarded. Wyatt caught her gaze and smiled, the kind of smile that tried not to scare her but still reached his eyes. "Morning, little one," he said. She didn't reply, only ducked her head shyly, clutching the hem of her dress. Clara's heart squeezed at the sight. Her daughter, cautious yet unafraid, and this man, who despite his ruggedness, had never once raised his voice near her. The three of them shared breakfast quietly. Wyatt thanked her after every bite, his manners unexpectedly gentle. He noticed how Clara's hands moved, strong but graceful, how her eyes softened when she looked at Elsie, how even her silence carried warmth. He'd seen plenty of beauty in his time, but none like this, the kind built from endurance, the kind that didn't fade when the candles went out. As days passed, Wyatt's presence became a quiet rhythm in their lives. He repaired the barn roof, fixed the broken fence, and brought firewood without being asked. At first, Clara protested, insisting she could handle it herself, but soon she realized it wasn't about her weakness. It was about him needing to feel useful, to belong. And strangely, she found comfort in that. He slept in the small shed behind the house, though Clara sometimes found herself standing by the window at night, watching the faint glow of his lantern flicker through the cold. Something inside her ached, something she didn't have a name for. When she caught herself staring too long, she'd whisper a quiet prayer and pull the curtains closed. One evening, after the day's work was done, Wyatt came in to return a borrowed coat. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, thunder rumbling somewhere distant. Clara stood by the table, kneading dough once more, her sleeves rolled up, her hair slightly undone. Wyatt paused at the doorway, watching her hands move, steady and sure. "You work too hard," he said. She looked up, a small smile tugging her lips. "Work keeps the mind quiet. Sometimes the mind needs noise," he replied, stepping closer. She hesitated, eyes meeting his. "Noise never brought me peace, Wyatt." He nodded, his expression softening. "Maybe not, but silence can be lonely too." For a moment, the only sound was the rain beginning to fall outside. He took a step closer, his shadow mingling with hers. Clara's heart thudded in her chest. He reached toward the dough, his large, calloused hands hovering over hers. "You're pressin' too hard," he murmured. "Let it breathe." His hands guided hers gently, his voice low, his breath brushing her temple. The touch wasn't bold, wasn't demanding, it was patient, reverent. Clara froze, the memory of loss flickering through her, the ache of years spent untouched. She wanted to pull away, but her body betrayed her. Her fingers relaxed, her heartbeat slowing as she followed his lead. For a brief, impossible moment, she felt what she hadn't allowed herself to feel, safe. When she looked up, their eyes met, close enough that she could see the storm of emotion behind his calm. She stepped back suddenly, the spell breaking. "That's enough," she said softly. He nodded once, stepping away with respect. "Sorry," he murmured, his voice rough. She shook her head. "You didn't do anything wrong. It's been a long time since someone." She stopped, unable to finish. He looked at her quietly, then said, "I ain't here to take what ain't offered, Clara. You don't owe me a thing." That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of rain against the window was steady, but her thoughts were not. She thought about the way his voice had trembled, about how his eyes had softened when he looked at Elsie, how careful his hands had been when they touched hers. She thought about what it would mean to let him stay, not just in her home, but in her life. The next morning, she found him outside chopping wood, his shirt damp from sweat and mist, his movements sure and strong. She stood on the porch for a long while, watching him. When he noticed her, he paused, wiping his brow. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said. "You didn't," she replied, crossing her arms. "You're up early. Have it," he said simply. The land don't rest. Neither did she realized. Neither of them knew how to stop surviving long enough to start living. As weeks turned to months, something like happiness began to take root, cautious, quiet, but real. The townsfolk still whispered when they saw Wyatt ride into town with Clara, but she didn't care anymore. He always walked a step behind her, never trying to claim her, only to protect her. When Elsie fell ill one evening, it was Wyatt who rode through a storm to fetch the doctor, his hands trembling when he carried the medicine back. He sat by the fire until morning, refusing to leave until the girl's fever broke. Clara watched him then. This man who had once been a stranger, now sitting with her child in his arms, whispering stories about the stars. Something inside her gave way. One night, as they sat outside beneath the starlit sky, she finally asked, "What are you running from, Wyatt?" He was silent for a long time before answering. "Myself, mostly," he said. "Used to think I could outrun my past. But the farther I went, the closer it followed." "What happened?" He looked down, rubbing his hands together. "Lost my brother in a gunfight. Sheriff said it was an accident, but I pulled the trigger. Been carrying that ever since." Clara felt a lump in her throat. "You're not the man who did that anymore." "Don't know if a man can ever stop being who he was," he said quietly. She reached out, her hand brushing his. "Then be someone new here." He looked at her, eyes glistening faintly in the moonlight. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she said. "But neither is living alone with ghosts." After that night, something changed. He smiled more, laughed sometimes, and even began teaching Elsie how to ride the old mare. Clara would watch from the porch, the sound of her daughter's laughter carrying through the air like music. It was the kind of sound she'd forgotten could exist in their home. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the fields, Wyatt looked up at her and said, "You ever think about leaving this place?" Clara smiled faintly. "Every winter. But then spring comes, and I remember why I stay." He chuckled softly. "Guess that's how I feel about you." Her heart stumbled at his words. "Don't say things you don't mean." "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. The next day, he was gone. No note, no goodbye, only his hat left hanging by the door. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She waited all day, convincing herself he'd gone to town for supplies, but night fell, and he didn't return. The ache that followed was sharper than she expected. Days passed, weeks. Then, one morning, as she was drawing water from the well, she saw him ride up the path, weary but alive. She wanted to be angry, but when she saw his face, the way his eyes found hers, full of apology and something deeper, she couldn't speak. "Had to set things right," he said quietly, dismounting. "Went back to the town where it happened. Told the sheriff the truth." Her breath caught. "Wyatt," he shook his head. "They cleared me. Said enough years had passed, and no man should live punished forever. I just needed to face it. Before I could stand here honest." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "And now I'm here," he said. "If you'll have me." For the first time since Clara didn't feel the need to think twice. She took his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You were never really gone, were you?" "Not from here," he said, pressing her hand to his chest. Seasons came and went after that, each one weaving their lives tighter together. Wyatt never asked her to marry him. He didn't need to. Their bond was built on something steadier than vows. It was built on quiet mornings and long silences that felt like understanding, on shared laughter and the way his hand would find hers without words. Sometimes, when the townsfolk gathered for fairs or church meetings, Clara caught people staring. Some with kindness, others with judgment. But she didn't care. She'd found her peace, her family, her home. Years later, when Elsie grew older and strong enough to run the ranch herself, Wyatt and Clara would often sit on the porch at dusk, watching the sun sink behind the hills. His hair had turned gray at the edges, and her hands were softer now, no longer trembling when they held his. One evening, as they sat together, Wyatt turned to her and said, "Funny how a man can spend his whole life looking for a place to belong and not realize it's been waiting behind a door he wasn't brave enough to knock on." Clara smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And funny how a woman can spend hers telling the world not to come inside, until someone does, and she's finally glad they didn't listen." He laughed quietly, pulling her closer. The night wrapped around them like an old friend, the stars burning bright above their quiet little home. The same house where once she'd said don't come inside, and where, years later, everything she ever needed had already been waiting, just on the other side of the door. The wind carried a strange stillness that evening, the kind that whispered of something coming. Clara sat on the porch, watching the horizon darken. Wyatt was down by the barn, tightening the gate hinges, his movements slow but certain. The years had added lines to his face, but his eyes still carried that same stormy calm that had once unsettled her, and now anchored her. The ranch had grown under their care, the land was strong again, and so was she. Yet, in the quiet spaces between their laughter and labor, Clara sometimes felt a shadow, something waiting in the distance, patient and cold. That night, when Wyatt came in, his face was tense. "There's talk in town," he said quietly, setting down his gloves. "About what?" "Trouble brewin'." His voice dropped lower. "They're sayin' men from the hills they been ridin' through, robbin' wagons, burnin' property." Sheriff stretched thin. Clara frowned. "We've got nothing they'd want." Wyatt shook his head. "Desperation don't care what a man's got, only that he's got more than them." For days after, the valley held its breath. Nights grew uneasy. Dogs barked at shadows, and the moon seemed sharper in the sky. Wyatt kept the rifle loaded near the door, though he tried not to let Clara or Elsie see his worry. But she felt it anyway, in the way his eyes flicked toward the windows at night, in the way his hand brushed her shoulder as if making sure she was still there. One evening, a knock shattered the quiet. Wyatt moved first, motioning Clara and Elsie back. He opened the door just enough to see two strangers on horseback, dust-caked and armed. Their faces were rough, their eyes mean with the kind of hunger that didn't come from food. "Evenin'," one said, his grin wide but hollow. "We're lookin' for work. Heard there's a ranch up this way with a generous hand." Wyatt's voice was steady. "Ain't no work here. Try the mill downriver." The man's eyes drifted past him, into the house. "Pretty place. Shame to waste all this space on just 3 folk." Wyatt stepped out, closing the door behind him. "You need to move on." The taller man leaned forward in his saddle. "You sound awful sure for someone who ain't the law." "I don't need to be," Wyatt said. "I just need to be the man who tells you this is where your road ends." For a moment, silence held tight. Then the men laughed, the sound sharp as metal. "We'll remember your kindness," the first one said, spitting in the dust before turning his horse. "See you round, friend." They rode off, but Clara saw the worry in Wyatt's eyes when he came back inside. "They'll come back," he said. That night, Wyatt didn't sleep. He sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the dark. Clara lay awake beside him, her heart pounding in the stillness. She had lived through loss before, but this fear, the fear of losing again, felt worse than death. The days that followed were heavy with waiting. Wyatt doubled the locks, checked the livestock, and taught Elsie how to hide if she heard gunfire. "You're scarin' her," Clara whispered one night. "I'm protectin' her," he replied. But deep down, they both knew, he was protecting them all. It was 3 nights later when the storm broke. The wind roared outside, and thunder rolled across the valley like hooves on stone. Clara woke to the faint crack of something outside, then another, sharper. Wyatt was already up, gun in hand. "Stay with Elsie," he said, his voice low but firm. She grabbed his arm. "Wyatt, don't." He looked at her, eyes steady even in the flicker of lightning. "I've run from too many fights, Clara. I ain't runnin' from this one." The door slammed open just as he reached it. A shadow burst through. The tall man from before, his coat soaked with rain and malice. The world erupted in chaos. Gunfire split the air. Clara screamed, pulling Elsie behind the stove. Wyatt returned fire, the sound echoing through the small house. The invaders stormed in, shouting curses, overturning furniture. "Wyatt!" Clara cried, crawling toward him as he ducked behind the table. He fired once more, and one of the men fell with a shout. But another came through the side door, swinging the butt of his rifle. Wyatt turned too late. The blow caught his shoulder, sending him sprawling. Clara grabbed the iron poker from the fire and struck the man as hard as she could. He stumbled back, cursing, and she hit him again, rage and terror giving her strength she didn't know she had. The man fell, groaning, and Wyatt pulled himself up, blood streaking his arm. Outside, the storm raged harder. The last of the raiders fled into the dark, their shouts fading into the thunder. Then, silence. Only the sound of rain and Clara's sobs filled the room. Wyatt sank against the wall, clutching his wound. "It's not bad," he muttered, though his voice wavered. Clara dropped beside him, pressing her hands over the bleeding. "Don't you dare lie to me, Wyatt came." He smiled weakly. "You always did see right through me." She held pressure to his wound, her tears falling freely now. "You promised me peace," she whispered. "I did," he breathed. "And I'll keep that promise." By dawn, the storm had passed. The sheriff came later that morning, bringing word that the outlaws had been caught down by the river. One dead, one wounded. Justice, they said, but Clara didn't feel any victory, only exhaustion and fear that refused to leave her bones. Wyatt slept for 2 days, feverish and pale, his breathing shallow. When he finally woke, Clara was sitting by his side, eyes red from crying. "You scared me," she said. He reached weakly for her hand. "Ain't the first time I scared someone. Just the first time I cared about it." Her heart broke and mended all at once. Spring came slowly that year. Wyatt's wound healed, but something in him didn't. He walked slower, grew quieter, often staring out at the horizon as if listening to something only he could hear. One afternoon, Clara found him sitting by the fence, the rifle across his lap, his gaze far away. "You're miles from here," she said softly. He looked up. "I keep thinking about how close it came. How I could have left you and that girl alone again." "You didn't," she said. "You're still here." He nodded but didn't smile. "A man like me, I ain't used to staying. Every time I find something good, I start waiting for the world to take it away." Clara knelt beside him. "Then stop waiting. Just live it, Wyatt. You've earned that much." He turned to her, and the weight in his eyes softened. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," she said. "But it's worth trying." That night, they lay beneath the stars again, side by side in silence. The sky stretched endless above them, the kind of vastness that humbles a soul. Wyatt took her hand, fingers rough and warm against hers. "I love you, Clara," he said simply. She closed her eyes, letting the words settle into her heart like a promise. "I know," she whispered. "I've known for a long time." Years passed, and the valley healed. Elsie grew into a woman with her mother's strength and her father's quiet fire. Wyatt's hair turned silver, Clara's eyes softened with time, and the ranch became more than a place of survival. It became a home where laughter lived again. But fate has a way of circling back, of testing even the strongest hearts. It was late one autumn evening when Wyatt rode out to check the northern pasture. A storm was brewing again, sharp and sudden. When he didn't return by nightfall, Clara's chest tightened with dread. She waited, pacing, the wind howling outside. Hours passed, no sound of hooves, no light on the ridge. By dawn, she found his horse by the gate, riderless. Her scream echoed through the hills. They searched the valley for 2 days before they found him near the creek. The storm had taken him by surprise. The old bridge had collapsed beneath him. He'd been thrown hard, his body cold but peaceful, as if he'd only fallen asleep. The sheriff said it was quick, that he wouldn't have suffered. But Clara suffered enough for both of them. She buried him under the big oak on the hill, the place where they'd first watched the stars together. The town came to pay respects, silent and somber. Elsie stood beside her mother, tears streaking her cheeks. When the last mourner left, Clara stayed by his grave, fingers tracing the carved words on the stone. Wyatt came, a man who came from the storm and found his home. She sat there long after sunset, the wind cool against her face. "You promised me peace," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you gave it to me. You gave me everything." The years after were quiet but full. Elsie married and stayed close, raising her own children on the same land that had tested and blessed their family. The house grew old, the wood worn smooth by memory. Clara tended the ranch as long as she could, every sunrise and sunset reminding her of him. Sometimes, in the evenings, she'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the light fade across the fields. And when the wind moved just right, she could almost hear him, that low, rough voice carried through the air. "You can let go now, Clara." One spring morning, decades after the night she first told him not to come inside, Clara didn't wake. Elsie found her sitting in her chair by the window, hands folded, eyes closed, a faint smile still on her lips. They laid her beside him on the hill, under the oak where the wildflowers grew. The valley was quiet that day, peaceful, golden, eternal. And some say, when the storms roll through that land now, two figures can be seen standing by that same house, a woman in a simple dress and a man in a weathered hat, watching the rain together. The lonely cowboy who once stood outside her door, and the single mother who once said please don't come inside, both finally home, inside each other's forever. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.